There is an old saying that Gwynn Hutchinson had heard once but paid no attention to. You can shear a sheep many times, but you can only skin him once. She continued to pay no attention to it at the Baroque Club later that night. Bizarre figures moved jerkily in the strobe light to British voices chanting behind pounding beats and strange, ethereal music. They were both women and cross-dressers in corsets, from underbusts and Amazons and bodices to full-body affairs that almost completely restricted movement, and all manner of gowns and costumes. Some men wore bondage gear, some in only a few pieces, and some in full regalia. Some wore damask waistcoats and ramilies, the powdered white wigs with curl rollers on the sides and the pigtails with the little bows, and stockings and buckle shoes, and they bowed to each other with flourishes and kissed one another's rings. At regular intervals there were ancient torture devices such as the wheel, the rack, and the gibbet, where a victim's pants were pulled down and either their asses were spanked or their genitals whipped with a silken cat o' nine tails. On the side opposite the door, across the dance floor, where nobody really danced per se, were more modern toys from mild electrocution, clamping, and so on. There were giant canopy beds with black velvet drapes along one wall on which strobe-lit shapes grappled with each other. Restaurant-style booths lined another wall with their own black drapes for discretion or seclusion. Nosferatu, Typo Negative, and Marilyn Manson were all heard in the length of time it took Gwynn to be doing steady business from the moment she walked through the door. Aside from the drugs themselves, she also sold crack stems and tufts of pre-shredded Brillo pads for the curious and the unprepared, those who'd only expected to drink or snort a bump of coke off of each other's car keys or fingernails. Before too long, the crowd was lit more by the sustained flames of cigarette lighters than by the sweeping shafts of party lights in the rafters. Face concealed beneath the Carnival mask, she had a hell of a time trying to smoke a Gauloise in one of the booths, so she finally took the damn thing off and threw it onto the table. The two guys across from her in Victorian and bondage couture, who were negotiating the purchase of $200 vials of acid, stared at her startling beauty. Barely managing to pull themselves together, they wrapped up their little transaction and rejoined their friends, describing her to them in wonder. One of them, a young woman barely legal, that everyone had nicknamed Dorothy, looked curiously at the half-drawn drapes enveloping the booth they just left. Charlotte, her middle only 15 inches around inside her red leather corset, clomped from the bar in her red platform heels over to the booth, a carafe of wine in one hand and 2 glasses in the other. "Busy?" she chirped, sticking her head in with a smile. "I brought you a drink." She held up the carafe, and Gwynn snatched it. "Ah, you shouldn't have." Charlotte watched with unbelieving eyes as the carafe was drained, gulp, gulp, gulp in one long go, leaving only the lees in a thin trail of color. And then that was gone too. "That's a little more like it," Gwynn managed, handing the empty carafe back to Charlotte, who took it and stared at the 2 empty glasses in her other hand, hovering less than 2 feet from Gwynn, still halfway through the motion of sitting down beside her. That really hit the spot. Thanks." Trying to salvage something, perhaps her dignity, Charlotte cleared her throat and asked if she could get a little something out of that bag for herself, whatever was handy. Gwynn gave her a look. "Now, honey, really? You know what a fix I'm in. I'm trying to scrape set together a little something of my own so I can get back on my feet. And that's just not going to happen if I give it all away for free, now is it? I tell you what, maybe I'll let you get something out of the next batch. How's that sound?" Charlotte mumbled something and backed out of the booth, set the glasses and carafe down on the coping of the short wall bordering the dance floor, not seeing the beautiful young woman everyone was calling Dorothy stride past her into the booth. "You don't get rich by paying for drinks," Gwynn was muttering, putting another Gauloise in the corner of her mouth. She lit it with an ornate Zippo she'd stolen from one of the squatters back at the house. "You don't get ahead by waiting your turn." She sucked on her teeth with a loud smack and turned to look as someone else came through the curtain. She caught her breath. The girl was tall but young, still just 18 and amazingly gorgeous. Her long black hair was in a French braid with a red bow tied at the end, near the small of her back, and her ample breasts stood out more with her abdomen constricted beneath them. If Gwynn had known anything about corsets, she could describe this one as an Edwardian blue gingham cotton underbust, breast covered in the same frilly white lace that comprised the very short skirt. Her strong legs were spider-webbed in white fishnet stockings, and on her feet were red patent leather stripper stacks. The both of them stared at each other for a long moment, each admiring the beauty of the other without trying to show it. "Shop's closed," the girl said finally. "Come buy me a drink." And she was gone. Gwynn blinked at the gently swaying fringe of the velvet curtains that marked the girl's passing. What in the... She blinked some more, wondering if that had really happened. Then, either affronted pride or curiosity made her zip up the duffel bag and hang it over one shoulder, draping her paisley shawl with the tassels over it as a formality, a perfunctory attempt to conceal it just enough to satisfy the security in the place. Slid out of the booth and stepped into the play of the lights, the hoop under her skirt ballooning black into shape. Remembering her mask, she reached back in to get it and strapped it to her head underneath her hair. Turned around to look for this impetuous girl and put her in her place. There she was, by the bar. Now, Gwynn was not gay. Sure, she'd messed around with another girl back in reform school, but who didn't? That didn't make you gay. Sure, she thought about that girl every now and then, but she chased those evil thoughts out of her head and resisted that voice, that traitor that said, "Yeah, you liked it, you little dyke." She wasn't gay. At all. But there was the girl, Dorothy, with her legs that went all the way up, that perfect ass just barely covered by the ruffles and picots of the skirt. She stared at that exquisite profile, torn between the urge to publicly belittle that proud girl and the longing to be her. The girl looked her way, smiled faintly, and Gwynn went to her. "Dorothy," she asked, "is that you?" The girl looked at Gwynn's eyes behind the mask and said nothing. For the first time in her life, Gwynn felt inept. "Take that off," the girl said. Gwynn hesitated, about to tell her that she took orders from no one, but for some reason found herself obeying. She lifted the Venetian mask carefully up off her face, letting her hair cascade down as the head strap came away. They looked at each other again, appraising, and finally the girl said, "My name is Enolah." "I'm Gwynn." "I don't like this crap wine everyone's drinking, Gwynn. This Morocco. I like Narcisse. Why don't you get us a bottle and we'll go off and talk?" Gwynn looked at Enolah's blood-red lips, at her flawless white skin. She smelled her perfume through the haze of smoke and sweat, and a faint thread of white oleander and something else. She wanted to say something clever and cutting, but when her breath passed through her throat and her mouth moved, she heard herself saying, "You have a bottle of Narcisse back there that you're not doing anything with?" Then noticed with embarrassment that she hadn't spoken loud enough, turned to lean across the bar and shouted for one of the bartenders. A skinny kid dressed in a tabard nodded in her direction as he fixed a rum runner, handed it over, got paid for it, and then came with his eyebrows raised and his mouth open to Gwynn, putting 2 fingers behind his ear and bending it toward her. She repeated herself and he nodded, going to the wine rack. Conscious of Enolah watching, Gwynn swung the duffel bag forward under her arm to get at one of the zippered ends where the money was. "I've been meaning to get a new handbag, but, Gwynn started to say, trying to be funny, but her attempt fizzled out and she went quiet. The flap came unzipped and the wads of cash started to fall out, but she managed to catch them before they embarrassed her further. She had close to $3,000 already, because once the word got out that there were $100 vials for sale, a line had formed at the ATM outside, and those going into the courtyard out back to smoke crack or in the bathroom to snort meth always came back before too long. By the time she'd gotten 8 20s out of the bag, the bartender was back with the bottle and a corkscrew saying, $147. They both watched the little silver man that was the corkscrew raise his arms until he was waist deep in the bottle's cork, his arms up in rapture and exultation. And when the arms were forced back down and he said, "Pop!" Gwynn wondered if she was the only one who thought shit like this, and paid for the bottle. Enolah carried the bottle and 2 glasses, leading Gwynn across the middle of the dance floor. Girls in skirts like the one Gwynn had on would see Enolah coming and step out of her way, curtsying low, and she nodded her head to each of them. They got to the black canopy beds on the other side, and Enolah flicked a hand dismissively at the group of goths sitting on the middle one. For a moment they just looked at her, then they looked at each other, slumped a little, and climbed off the bed. A few of the more androgynous ones smirked derisively at Gwynn for no good reason at all, as if she were the one being kicked off the bed. Her lip curled at them in disgust, and then she noticed people drifting toward the booth she had occupied, like cartoon people pulled along by a visible snake-like thread of fragrance, only to find the booth empty and walk away disappointed. She saw how much money she was losing, remembered how much she'd spent on wine for some teenager who, she turned back to Enolah, saw her white form shimmering in the lights, leaning back against the pillows 10 feet away. Swinging the duffel onto the bed, she lifted her skirt and clambered on after her, feeling less ladylike than she would have wished. She had nothing on underneath, having taken off the briefs so that she could have them halfway clean to wear home tomorrow. Maybe her nudity was in shadow, but the hoop under her skirt that held its shape made her look ridiculous, and she gritted her teeth at the idea of mooning the entire club. Enolah grinned. Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships? She had to shout to be heard. That's not funny, Gwynn snapped. God damn it, this is embarrassing, and you got me into it. You'll get over it. Come on, you don't have much farther to go. I could be back there making money, but... That sound you just heard? That was my heart breaking. Gwynn stopped to glare at her, gnashing her teeth, and Enolah put on a solemn face and played an imaginary violin. Nothing enraged Gwynn more than her pride being wounded, but the girl dispelled it with a come-hither crook of her finger. Gwynn rose up on her knees and folded her arms. She was still trying to reconcile herself with whatever this was, or whatever this might turn into, with another girl, in a public place no less. It may be the 1990s, and the world was changing, but it hadn't changed that much yet. The carafe she had drained so quickly might have affected her judgment, she was thinking.